elephant in the room. Flawless strategic execution? Yeah, it's mostly a myth. We constantly hear these grand narratives about visionary leadership and perfectly planned operations, but today, we're going to name the reality, and we're going to do it without apology. Look, most companies absolutely do not operate through flawless execution. They muddle through. They react to crises, they manage internal friction, and they make these tiny incremental adjustments, all while spinning a much cleaner, glossier story for the outside world. And hey, this isn't a criticism at all. It's honestly just a description of how things actually work. The real question we need to tackle today is whether muddling through is a temporary state for your organization or a permanent, completely unsustainable condition.
You know, author Catherine Senner actually hits the nail on the head here. She says we're all just muddling through, and nobody has the answers. That sentiment strikes right at the very heart of corporate operations, because behind the polished PR and those bold mission statements, nobody truly has all the answers neatly mapped out for the next 10 years. So I want you to ask yourself, and just be totally honest for a second, how does your organization really operate when the doors are closed? When you're supposedly out there delighting the customer, does the operational and financial data just flow in perfectly? Is everyone completely in sync, fired up, and working in faultless harmony? Or does it feel, well, a little bit more chaotic than you'd like to admit? Because let's face it, there's this massive gap between the external story and the internal reality. On one side, we have the absolute ideal. You know, those magical, colorful Power BI dashboards that suggest perfect, long-term strategic clarity. But on the other side, we have the daily reality. Operations defined by trial and error, reacting to whatever today's crisis happens to be, and managing some pretty intense internal friction. And the truth is, the vast majority of companies survive right there on that right side.
Okay, moving into Section 1, the warning signs of quiet erosion. Now, since we know muddling through is totally normal, we've got to know how to spot when it turns into an actual downhill slide. Here's the thing. No company just stands up and announces its decline. You are never going to get a corporate memo saying, hey, we miscalculated, the model's broken, and we're out of options. If you look at business history, especially here in Kenya and East Africa, major companies rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. Instead, they manage failure quietly. It's a lot like the fall of the Roman Empire. Corporate deterioration shows up quietly in odd little decisions, sudden shifts in behavior, and these glaring contradictions between what a company says and what it actually does. So what does this actually look like on the ground? Analyst Christine Loreley points out that a huge red flag is constant restructuring, usually disguised with a word like evolution. In our local market, you'll suddenly see pricing models flip, compensation shifts, or core features quietly vanishing behind paywalls. Stuff that used to be the very heart of the product is suddenly reframed as a test. Users and employees are just repeatedly expected to adapt with almost zero explanation. And this is crucial. When a company just keeps rewriting the rules instead of actually improving the system, they're not innovating, they're just buying time. They are shifting the cost of their own internal mess onto the people who rely on them. Throw in slow response times and a habit of deleting institutional memory just because they're afraid of being wrong, and you've got a textbook picture of a company in quiet decline. And pay attention to the language, because the language always shifts when a business is in trouble. Healthy businesses, they talk about tangible outcomes, measurable results. Failing businesses, though, they start talking about potential. The moment performance slips, the conversation conveniently pivots away from the hard numbers and straight into abstract concepts like mission statements, values, community, and long-term impact. And sure, those things matter. Absolutely. But vision becomes a really convenient shield to hide behind when the numbers stop speaking for themselves.
All right, let's look at Section 2, bureaucracy and approval theater. So when companies try to wrangle all this messiness, they usually just end up slapping on layers of complexity. And fun fact, flying by the seat of your pants actually has a very fancy academic name. It's called disjointed incrementalism. It was formalized way back in 1959 by Charles Lindblom. He looked at the highest levels of U.S. government bureaucracy and realized that massive, perfectly planned reforms were basically a myth. Instead, policymakers just made small, step-by-step adjustments to solve immediate, pressing problems. They just handled things pragmatically as they popped up. So if it feels like your company is just taking things one day at a time, hey, you're actually participating in a deeply entrenched organizational theory.
But over time, taking things day by day creates a massive problem, especially if you're growing. Think about the classic founder's bottleneck. In the beginning, a company survives on pure, relentless hustle and a really insightful core idea. But as the months and years pass and the company scales up, the thinking and the systems, they don't upgrade. So that exact hands-on, in-the-weeds approach from the founder that works so brilliantly on day one eventually becomes a massive roadblock. The systems haven't matured, so the staff are just forced to figure it out as they go.
And because keeping things simple is honestly really hard, companies take the easy way out. They just add complexity. And boom, you get approval theater. It's a painfully recognizable trap in the Kenyan corporate world where the system values control over actual traction. Everyone looks incredibly busy, you've got meetings to plan, other meetings, but true progress, it just gets completely bogged down in the mud.
So the big takeaway here is this. Muddling through? Yeah, it's a super resilient approach for a while. It's a wildly popular item on the management menu. But eating it every single day is not healthy. Over time, it completely drains your staff's energy and makes your business incredibly vulnerable to market shifts. It describes reality, yes, but treating it as a permanent strategy is a recipe for disaster.
Which brings us to Section 3, the treatment from muddling through.
So, if disjointed incrementalism has basically become your daily corporate diet, how do you fix it? Well, Melinda French Gates actually has some fantastic advice here. She says, the most important thing you can do is keep learning and stay open to change. Look, creative destruction is a real thing, but an early corporate death can often be stopped. It just requires an absolute, unshakable willingness to stay open, to pivot, and to stop defending systems that are clearly failing.
Real, effective early intervention starts with a serious, unflinching corporate health check. You've literally got to look past your own hype, strip away the glossy PR statements, and look at the messy reality of what's happening. You have to start asking different and honestly pretty difficult questions about why you're operating the way you are. You've got to be willing to rethink fundamental business assumptions that just aren't serving you anymore. The cure demands early detection and a truly honest, objective external diagnosis so you can finally tear down the approval theater.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, kind of provocative question to chew on regarding your own leadership. Are you just quietly managing failure right now? Or are you actively rethinking your core assumptions? Are you just buying time? Or are you actually innovating? Listen, if your organization recognizes itself in any of this today, if you see that glaring gap between the dashboard and the reality, or that restructuring that just leads to more restructuring, or a grand vision being used to cover up a lack of results, then early intervention is critical. And that is exactly where a catalyst enters the conversation. This is a conversation worth having right now, not later when your options have run out. For an honest, direct look at what early intervention really looks like, head over to www.acatalyst.co.ke. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it helps you take a much clearer look at how your organization is actually running.